Hello, I'm here with Christopher Cavallio,
Hello.
and today we're going to talk about EQ. So EQ is a term that's used constantly in the music production community, and I do think a lot of people don't actually know what it means. So Christopher, could you explain in a couple sentences what EQ actually is?
Okay, in a couple of sentences. Well, first sentence, there are two things. So, EQ is equalization, and it refers to a process where you rebalance the frequency content of a signal or of a recording or of a track. So yeah, that's what it means. That's what it refers to: equalization or equalizing. People also borrow the word and say, "Oh, the EQ of this track," or the EQ, and what they're actually referring to is the frequency balance of that signal. Why we use an EQ is to adjust the balance of frequencies in a signal. Any complex sound, like the human voice, or pretty much anything, has lots of different frequencies happening in it. Lots of frequency content in there. Low, mids, highs, that sort of thing. All at different balances, and an EQ is there to adjust the balance of frequencies in the sound. So for example, if you're trying to mix a vocal into a song, but there's too much low end, there's too much muddiness in the sort of bottom end, like the deepness of the vocal, then you'll use an EQ to kind of reduce gain or reduce volume of those frequencies whilst mostly preserving the relative volume of the other frequencies in that signal, which is why EQ is a great mixing tool, because the mix might not have the space for that extra low end that the vocals got, because there's some other instruments in that sort of band. So reducing that in the vocal performance is a good idea. Sometimes a performance might have, or a recording might have, too much resonance at a certain frequency, which means that frequency is just too loud in that recording for a myriad of reasons. Like the microphone could just be more sensitive at that frequency, or the performance might be more sensitive at that frequency and it's not right for the mix, or the room that you recorded in might be boosting or attenuating certain frequencies, because the room that you record in or that you listen in has an effect on the frequency balance of what you are recording and what you are listening to, for a myriad of reasons. And so EQ just helps us rebalance those frequencies for whatever reason that we need to do it. There are lots of different types of EQ.
Yeah, so what is a linear phase EQ? That's one that's obviously comes with Logic Pro 10. What's the difference between, say, the channel EQ and the linear phase EQ? Okay, so a channel EQ.
So first of all, the very nature of EQ is a phase. It's a phase distortion. It distorts the phase of the frequencies in the signal. I don't want to go too deep, but phase is time. So anytime you hear the word phase in audio or music production, just think time. Okay? So if it has a later phase, it just means the signal was delayed. Anyway, so when you're using a minimum phase EQ, or some might call it a natural phase EQ, like the channel EQ in Logic, or pretty much any analog EQ that we've been using for many, many decades. That EQ, when you do an EQ, when you do an adjustment, let's say you do a low pass filter that reduces the volume of the higher frequencies and leaves the lows. What you are doing, and it's the very nature of EQ to do this. EQ does this; it has to do this. It's how it does its job, but it changes the phase relationship between frequencies. Now, that's totally normal, and in many cases it's negligible as an issue because it's it just is, and for reasons I'm not going to go into much detail on. But a minimum phase, a normal EQ does that. It changes the phase relationships between frequencies. So let's say that you were applying a minimum phase or a channel EQ on a stereo mix of an orchestra. Okay, so in an orchestra, you've got, you've got some things coming from the front of the stage, and you've got some stuff coming from the back of the stage, like the orchestra does, right? You've got the timpanis over there, but you might have violins or something over here, or whatever. If you apply a normal EQ to a stereo mix of that, it's going to distort the phase relationships. Now, that timpani is further away to the listening position, or to the listener, or the mix, if you like, than the violin that's just over here. Again, phase is time. So if you're using a minimum phase EQ, technically, you are likely, but probably negligibly, changing that phase relationship. So it's kind of like it could be weird and unnatural because you've changed that time difference between something that was over there and something that was over here. So that's what a normal EQ does. That's what analog EQs have done forever. How big of a problem that is totally depends on everything. Totally depends on what you're EQing, how much you're EQing, and why you're EQing it in the first place. Now, linear phase doesn't do that. It's linear phase. It preserves the time relationships between the frequencies. So it doesn't. It's designed to not have an effect on those relationships in terms of distance and time. This is all really simplistic, by the way. Believe it or not, this isn't even doing that subject that much justice. But Thomas asked. So yeah, a linear phase, preserves the phase relationship between frequencies, so that when you're changing the bass or changing the high end or something, it's neither of those frequencies are earlier or later than they should be relative to everything else. So it's good. That's why people do recommend linear phase for like mix bus or entire mix processing or mastering.
The thing with the linear phase, it takes up so much CPU power. It
does. First of all, it introduces it. First of all, actually, I should say it is not a perfect instrument. It has its own problems. I don't buy into the advice that you should use linear phase because you are mastering. That's not necessarily true, because it has its own problems. Not just practical problems like introducing latency into the system or just, those sort of practical issues. But actually it has issues such as pre-ringing, which can really distort the transients in the signal. So like it can really hurt the way that the kick drum lines up against everything else, or like just the effect of the transient of it, as an example, because it has like pre-ringing is kind of like a pre-echo in a way of the signal, because the very nature of an EQ or a filter is actually a series of delays in succession, or they're called finite response filters or something like that, infinite response. There's every EQ has its distortion, has a side effect, and when push comes to shove, you kind of have to go by ear and by theory at the same time. I don't use, like when mastering, I don't always use linear. More often than not, actually, I use TDR Nova, which actually has a parallel topology, but that's a whole other thing. So yeah, you asked about that, and
So
that's the best answer I can give you on that at the moment. But I seriously advise that you actually look into that further. But just don't think that either of them are perfect, because they're not.
Do you think it's a good idea to use the analyzer? Because, for example, the Channel EQ in Logic Pro 10, there's the analyzer, so you can see the frequencies visually. Or do you think it's a better idea to start off just using your ear, or maybe a combination of the two?
Analyzers are useful. Analyzers are a supplement to what you're hearing. It's as simple as that. You know, sometimes, you know, like de-essing or something like that, I turn on sometimes the input analyzer on TDR Nova, just because it just makes sense sometimes. Like I'm going to see it and I can easily point the frequency and then I can move it by ear, or sometimes the other way around, if that makes sense. You know, it just, analyzers are useful. They're not a replacement for what you're hearing. They're a supplement for what you're hearing. And if you just use that mindset, I think you'll be all right. But, you know, at the same time, a reliance on them might not be a good thing, because you're just not training your ears or whatever. But, yeah, you know, practically when you're trying to get the job done in like de-essing or something like that, or if you hear the resonance and you're just not exactly sure where the frequency is, if your EQ doesn't have a band solo feature like TDR Nova does, you know, or you're just trying to train your ears or whatever, you know, you can do the classic bump, you know, gain up and sweep until you find it, because it will start ringing more, and then attenuate it. But yeah, analyzers are great. They're useful if you're using them right. But just don't think that, you know, it has to look this way, because that will make it, looking this way will make it sound better. That's not how it works. But analyzers are really useful. They supplement your ears.
Do you think there's any point using any analog gear for your analog EQs, or is digital EQs perfectly fine?
So analog EQs will, sometimes I use an analog modeling EQ because it has flavor, it has vibe, but more often than not, especially in mastering, I'm not trying to change the sound of the mix. I'm just trying to help it, you know. So I'll go for the most transparent tool, which is normally just a perfectly digital EQ or something like that. You know, it depends actually the type of EQ. One thing that I haven't talked about is, you know, the two categories that people generally put the applications of EQ down into are surgical or otherwise, if you like, you know. So surgical is like that I need to fix that resonance at 300 hertz. I need to attenuate it. You're not going to use the flavorful console emulating, saturating EQ for that. You're going to go with the cleanest, most precise thing, because you're trying to solve that problem. But if you are EQing after that in mastering, you know, the reason I'm talking about mastering is because we've kind of gone down the mastering path of these questions, because generally, especially the linear phase stuff, you know, it's like I said, it depends why you're using it. Like if you're trying to just notch out certain problems, certain resonances in the signal, then you know, you're going to want probably the cleanest, most surgical thing, and you can just go in and solve that problem, and you've done minimal compromise or minimal change to the rest of the sound. But if it's like a console EQ that you're using for mastering because you want to boost up a bit of warmth here, or, you know, pull down the highs or add some air or whatever, you might use like a silky analog modeling EQ because you like the flavor of it or whatever. But this is stuff that you learn your tools, and then you just instantly go, this is the best tool for this job because I want that flavor. If you don't want flavor, you use the cleanest digital EQ you've got, which is probably all of them, because there's not actually many different implementations of a digital EQ, apart from when you go into like TDR Nova and stuff like that, where it's got like parallel and all that stuff. But, you know, there's minimum phase, linear phase and stuff like that. Most digital EQs fall under those categories for the most part. So yeah, everything is dependent on what you're doing, why you're doing it, and sometimes who you're doing it for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Any other questions? There's probably some other things that I could talk about with EQ. So, I mean, like I said, it's a tool to balance the frequencies in a signal, but there are also, you'll hear the term parametric EQ quite a lot. A parametric EQ is basically where, like many EQs that you'll find in your plugins, parametric refers to basically the ability to choose the frequency that you're EQing, how much gain you're applying to that frequency, and then the quality factor is how wide of a band you are affecting. So if you're trying to get a really narrow resonance, trying to sort that out surgically, you're probably going to have a really narrow Q to affect only that, and try not to affect the frequencies either side of it or above and below it. But a parametric is the ability to choose frequency, choose the quality factor, and choose the amount of gain that you're applying. And your EQ might have, the ability to do that to 4, 5, 6, 7 bands in one instance of an EQ. A graphic EQ is kind of like on an old hi-fi system or an old stereo system, you've just basically got a series of faders. They're all stuck at different frequencies, and the only thing that you change is the gain of each of those frequencies, So yeah, and to be honest, I think that is as much of an overview as EQ, and then a bit more because.
So can you use EQ to create effects like filtering?
Yeah. Oh yeah. So there's all of the creative applications for EQ. Like synthesizers have filters built into them. It's the same family of processing. So yeah, I mean,
sweep out the lows, sweep out the highs.
Yeah, absolutely.
High pass, low pass, band pass, reject, that kind of thing. You could do it all in EQ.
Yeah, or if you
automation as well.
Automate, you could do a low pass and automate the frequency up or down through the build up or the breakdown or whatever, and that's cool. And you could do all of those things, but just like any tool, you can use it for practical, surgical. Practical purposes, and you can use it for creative, outlandish purposes and part of the sound design that you're doing.
Yeah, so that's I was going to say brief summary, but that's a summary of EQ.
Yeah, brief, and then a bit more, and then back to brief again, and then some.
So I hope you found this video useful. All about EQ. Thank you, Christopher.
Yep, my pleasure, as always.
And we'll talk to you next time.
Cheers.